Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you for coming out. My name is Piers Turner. I'm one of the organizers of the Center for Ethics and Human Values and its Compass program. All year, the Compass program has been organizing events around the idea of inequality, domestic and global. And we're coming towards the end of our year where we have a couple great events still to go. This one we're very excited about. And then on April 11th at 4 p.m. we have the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen coming to give a talk on campus. So if you haven't, you can go to our website, the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and you can RSVP for that event. And it's open and free and open to the public. Anyway, okay, again, welcome everybody for coming. So the talk today is co-sponsored between the Compass program and the Political Theory Workshop, which is housed in the Political Science Department. And so we're thrilled to be able to have Juliana Bidadanure, so close, here to give us a talk on basic income, an egalitarian proposal. And then Philipp Rehm, something like close, I'm working on these names, is going to be, he's a professor in the political science department and he's going to be our commentator today. So we'll have Juliana speak for somewhere between 30-40 minutes maybe, then Philip will go for I think up to like 15-ish minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions after that. Okay? So thanks, let's welcome our speaker.
For the introduction and for the invitation. I'm really, really happy to be here. It's my first time in Columbus and I've really enjoyed my time here so far, so thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Everyone? Yeah, good. As Piers said, my name is Juliana Bidadanure. I'm a philosophy professor, assistant professor at the University of Stanford. And so far I've been working in political philosophy in general, on inequalities, and in particular on inequalities between the age groups. So I'm interested in age group justice. I also have an interest in basic income. And I've been teaching a graduate seminar on basic income at Stanford University this year, which I've been enjoying very much. So we look at basic income from a variety of different perspectives, normative perspectives. And so when Piers invited me to talk about basic income as part of this series on inequalities, I thought I would try to answer the question, is basic income an egalitarian proposal? Right? So I tried to write a talk answering that question. So let's see how it turned out. Basic income is a radical policy proposal which consists of a monthly cash grant given to all members of the community without means test, regardless of personal desert, no strings attached, and under most proposals, sufficiently high to live a life free from duress. In recent years, it rapidly went from a utopian proposal to a policy with growing currency throughout the world. Experiments have been conducted in countries as different as Finland, Brazil, Namibia, India, and Canada. The debate had not been picking up in the US as much as elsewhere in the past 2 decades. But in the last couple of years, more and more movement and personalities in the US have expressed their interest in the policy. And that includes Elon Musk, Andrew Stern, the former president of the Service Employees International Union, Robert Reich, Ai-jen Poo, Charles Murray, and Martin Ford. The fear that automation may displace workers from the labor market at unprecedented rates has been an important driver of renewed interest in UBI in the US. And notably, the tech incubator Y Combinator is also currently testing basic income in Oakland, and the Economic Security Project was launched in 2016, devoting $10 million to research on basic income in the next 2 years. So basic income has been defended from a range of philosophical perspectives, including right and left libertarian, Republican, post-productivist, feminist, and it has mainly been discussed and embraced as an instrument of freedom. If people have access to sufficient unconditional income, the idea is that they will be better positioned to make free choices. For libertarians, basic income grants people the freedom to do whatever they may want to do, whereas conditional benefits or vouchers don't. For Republicans, Republicans in political theory, basic income increases freedom from domination for those most unemployed, for those most vulnerable. For instance, dependents from their spouses, workers from their bosses, or the unemployed from bureaucrats. Fewer, even though quite a few have, but fewer have suggested that basic income could be seen as an instrument of equality. And yet, I believe that basic income can be defended as such, and so that's what I'm going to argue today. But when we think of an egalitarian proposal, we tend to think about a policy that reduces the gap between rich and poor. UBI is given to all, rich and poor, so it can't be seen as reducing inequalities in that direct manner. What's more, it's no coincidence that basic income has attracted libertarian thinkers, and has been quite notoriously opposed by labor unions. UBI skeptics on the left tend to think that basic income proponents too readily give up on the backbone of socialism, which is work. They also tend to worry that UBI may even be detrimental to egalitarian justice if it is sold as a pill that will solve all ills, all social ills, making maybe market regulations unnecessary and full-speed automation seem less objectionable. So in this talk, I will ask whether UBI can be seen as an egalitarian proposal. I'll give you a table of content in a few minutes, but let me start by providing some clarifications as to what that question means. Is UBI an egalitarian proposal? That's the question I'm going to attempt to answer. So in attempting to answer the question that motivates this talk, one would probably want to respond immediately as follows. It depends. First, it depends on which basic income proposal we are considering. For instance, it depends on how it is funded, on the level of the cash grant, on what it replaces. Second, it also depends on what we mean by egalitarian. There are quite a few different conceptions of equality in contemporary philosophy and political discourses, so it depends on that. Third, it also depends on what we mean by an egalitarian proposal. Do we mean that a policy is underpinned by egalitarian values, whatever that may mean? Or do we mean that it is necessary to achieve egalitarian justice? And maybe that is not sufficient, or maybe it is sufficient. In order to not have to struggle with those questions throughout the talk, let me try to answer some of those now. So indeed, probably it depends on what we mean by egalitarianism. So in some fairly minimal sense, most of us are egalitarian, insofar as we believe in what has been referred to as basic equality. The fact that human beings are of equal moral worth and that no group is naturally unworthy of being treated as such. So it may seem fairly uncontroversial now, but obviously it has not always been asserted and it's still denied by some. Now, by egalitarianism, I will mean something stronger than the belief in basic equality. For egalitarians in this stronger sense, we ought to design the social structures of society in a way that prevents inequalities of some sort and promotes equality in some way. Contemporary egalitarianism was shaped by the equality of what debate. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with that one, which has given rise to a myriad of different conceptions of equality. Some take resources to be the currency of egalitarian justice. Others put forward welfare, opportunities, capabilities, power, voice, status, of various combinations of all of those, as the right answer to the equality of what question. And depending on what we put the emphasis on, we may have different answers to the question of whether basic income is an egalitarian proposal. Most egalitarian theorists agree that we should seek to introduce policies that will make the least well-off as well-off as they can, but they have diverging views of which inequalities in particular are wrong. For instance, welfare egalitarians may believe that those who are unjustly worse off in society are those with the lowest level of well-being. Whereas resources egalitarians identify the worse off as those who have access to fewer resources. So those groups might overlap very much, but they might also be distinct. Both welfare and resources egalitarians may be luck egalitarians. If they believe that inequality is wrong, if and only if it results from brute luck. So for instance, if I'm worse off because I was born a woman, or because I was educated in failing schools, I should be compensated for bad brute luck. If, however, I am worse off because I decided to be an artist, when I could have been a lawyer, knowing very well the costs of adopting that lifestyle, then the resulting inequality in resources may be just fine from that perspective, that normative perspective. For welfarist non-egalitarian, the inequality is objectionable if and only if I am unwell as a result of my choice to become an artist. But the lawyer may actually be worse off here if she's unhappy, right? So even she has more resources than me. So the lawyer, in this case, could actually be owed a compensation. So you can see that there are a wealth of different conceptions of inequalities, and depending on which one we subscribe to, we might have a very different answer to the question, is basic income an egalitarian proposal? So here I'm going to focus on the egalitarian theory that makes more sense to me in general. And I believe that it is sufficiently broad and inclusive to capture many of our considered judgments on what we think equality, on why we think equality matters, and on which inequalities we take to be objectionable. It is called social egalitarianism, and others have referred to it as relational egalitarianism or social relations egalitarianism. And so this conception of justice has been revived in recent years by contemporary philosophers like Elizabeth Anderson, Jonathan Wolff, Iris Byron Young, Simon Scheffler, Martin O'Neill, Tim Scanlon, and many others. And it has its roots in Rousseau's formulation of the goals of a society of equals, when no one is too poor to be bought, and no one is too rich to enslave others. Social egalitarians believe that a just society is one in which people relate to each other as equals, and free from domination and oppression. Central to this conceptualization of equality are the notions of equal social standing, equal status, equal respect, and equal political power. And this view stems from a critical response to the dominant view, the dominant distributive view about equality in contemporary literature, which I have just introduced as luck egalitarianism. The view that egalitarianism must achieve a society where brute luck is neutralized and people's unequal holdings can be traced back to genuine individual choices. So social egalitarians emphasize respect and non-domination, in great part regardless of whether a given social inequality can be traced back to individual choice. If my lawyer friends are able to oppress me socially and politically as an artist, then social egalitarians believe that this inequality is problematic and perhaps objectionable, regardless of whether I chose to become an artist or not. Social egalitarians believe that luck egalitarians are too harsh with those who make poor choices. And luck egalitarians on this view are also willing to tolerate inequalities that would lead to domination, whereas that's unacceptable for social egalitarians. Social egalitarians think that no one should be as poor as to be dominated, and no one as rich as to be in a position to dominate others, largely regardless of the choices they make. But they also think that inequalities that do not risk leading to domination are not necessarily wrong. So they might be willing to accept that some distributive inequalities are acceptable, insofar as they don't lead to a society where some groups are marginalized or dominated or oppressed. So social egalitarians, and that's another specification of their views, generally oppose hierarchies that lead to marginalization, infantilization, segregation, demonization. And in this sense, they worry about societies not meeting the goal of people being able to relate as equals. So they use the vocabulary of domination, which will be very familiar to Republican thinkers as well. And they also have this conception that we need to be able to relate in the right way to each other. Okay, so this is the conception of equality I'm going to work from. It also, so the answer to this question, or understanding this question adequately, also depends on which UBI proposal we are considering. So I need to be quite explicit here about what UBI must look like, in my view. But I don't want you to leave this room thinking that you only have an answer to the question, is the very particular proposal of BI that the speaker has selected an egalitarian proposal. That would be too narrow. I want to say something that can be true of many, if most, UBI proposals out there, at least as they are currently presented in the now global discourse on basic income. And it is worth first noting that all the various basic income proposals out there share in common a number of definitional features. So basic income is an allowance that is distributed in cash, is distributed in regular payments, so either weekly or monthly. It is individual, it's unconditional, and universal. And proposals may vary in many respects, but these features are the constant that remain across various proposals. They are definitional features of basic income. And so I'm going to focus on those features in this talk and try to see whether we can provide social egalitarian justifications for basic income's unconditionality, individuality, and universality, and for basic income being a periodic payment. In addition, I will assume a basic income that is, to make it easier, let's think of basic income as a $1,000 monthly grant, right? So again, the level is not constant from one proposal to the next. I'm doing this because I think it's a proposal that exists out there, and very often when we think about what UBI can achieve, we think about the UBI that's close to the poverty line, that's slightly above the poverty line. I will also assume that UBI is an addition to the existing welfare states, so I'm not going to think here of a UBI that replaces healthcare or that replaces education. You know, I'm just thinking of UBI as an enhanced safety net, a cash safety net. Okay, so of course some benefits would become redundant if we introduce basic income, so it would replace some benefits, but I'm not thinking of UBI as a replacement for the welfare state. Okay. Last, I'll be neutral on the funding mechanism. The various funding mechanisms that have been proposed for basic income include progressive taxation of various sorts, a wealth tax, a consumption tax, financial transaction taxes, carbon taxes, a combination of those. And I'm remaining neutral here because I do not want my discussion of UBI as an egalitarian proposal to be dependent upon the funding mechanism. I don't want to be discussing which funding proposal is egalitarian. And that's, of course, a very important question, but here I want to remain focused on what UBI can achieve and on those features there. And last, the answer to this question and understanding this question adequately depend on what we mean by an egalitarian proposal. So one way for basic income to be an egalitarian proposal would be for it to be necessary for egalitarian justice. And it is clear for many that basic income is insufficient on its own to bring about an egalitarian society. Actually, this is often an objection that's raised against basic income by UBI skeptics on the left, that basic income is insufficient on its own to promote the goal of egalitarian justice. But left-leaning proponents of UBI also express the view that UBI can only achieve so much in light of growing inequalities. So it's pretty much something that you find within the basic income literature. So for instance, in the forthcoming Boston Review article, which I think must be out this week or next week, Bridge and Rogers claims we cannot ensure good work and equality through one-step policy solutions, even if the policies have great merit. Unconditional basic income is insufficient to tackle poverty, he argues, exploitation and growing inequalities in power and control. We also need to resist privatizations and deregulations of labor laws, enhance social bargaining, and provide affordable healthcare and education for all. That's what he argues. In short, then, from a progressive perspective, UBI is necessary but not sufficient. As an egalitarian theorist, I myself tend to think that UBI cannot possibly be the entire deal. It is only a part of the egalitarian toolkit, as Stuart White helpfully puts it. But I've been hearing and reading versions of the claim that UBI is insufficient a bit too often lately. So much that I'm starting to doubt its discursive purposes and effects. For one, it is definitely true, but it's also trivially true. It is true of UBI, and it's also true of any other policy. Second, it would be helpful to say that UBI is not sufficient if indeed too many people thought that it was sufficient to fight inequalities. And that is not true of the vast majority of progressive supporters of basic income, though, and of the basic income movement in general. Supporters of UBI on the right of the political spectrum sometimes argue, in fact, that UBI is all we need. But then again, they don't think that inequalities are necessarily wrong in the first place. So the point will not move them anyway. The fact that basic income is insufficient to tackle inequalities and growing inequalities. So insisting that BI is insufficient for egalitarian justice often serves to obscure the reasons that make UBI necessary or even just very important for egalitarian justice. From the basic message that UBI is insufficient, we often seem to get to the view that UBI is somehow superfluous for progressive change, an unavoidable part of the complicated package. Eventually, therefore, insisting that UBI is insufficient often ends up unnecessarily sapping a rising enthusiasm for the policy for no good reason. And since I'm not mistaken, most UBI proponents on the left don't actually buy the one-stop policy story anyway. So in this paper, I will provide some arguments in defense of the view that UBI is an important policy tool to achieve a more equal society. I won't necessarily go as far as arguing that it is necessary. There may be other policies which, combined with other policies, could do very well in achieving the goal of egalitarian justice. But I'll argue that UBI can get us a long way and should be the ideal safety net of social egalitarians. I'll take UBI's definitional structure, definitional features in turn, and motivate them from the egalitarian perspective. To be sure, there are many different justifications for these features of UBI, some pragmatic, some practical, some feasibility-driven. But in what follows, I can't possibly be exhaustive, but I'm going to try to motivate those features of basic income from the social egalitarian perspective. Right, so we've done the introduction and tried to understand the question a bit better, and now I'm going to motivate the individual, unconditional, universal, and regular features of basic income from that perspective. So, basic income is delivered on an individual basis. Most means-tested benefits, existing benefits systems or income support schemes are household-based. That means two related things. They establish eligibility based on household income, and once they have established eligibility, they pay the grant to the household. The family is thus taken to be the unit of concern for distributive purposes. This means that poor individuals within a household considered rich enough, so that if the household is considered rich enough, poor individuals within a household do not receive a welfare payment of their own. A wageless spouse, depending on the region of partner, for instance, is not eligible for many of the welfare benefits that are provided. This family is often a space, the family in general, is often a space of solidarity and support, so it seems to make sense to consider it as such. But families are also spaces of contention and potentially domination. Nothing ensures, in fact, that the distribution of resources within the family are just. So nothing ensures that the distribution of resources from the breadwinner to the caretaker or the unemployed dependent allows dependents to lead a dignified life. And if the household as a whole is eligible for welfare support, nothing guarantees that the welfare payment will be distributed fairly within the family. From a social egalitarian perspective, the focus of family rather than individuals is quite worrying. Social egalitarians are liberal in that they take rights to be individual properties, and we often want to value or even encourage familial solidarity, but eventually we should be concerned about how each individual is faring. This is what we should be considering. Since we cannot guarantee, and in fact there is contrary evidence, that dependents within households are invulnerable to domination, we should make sure that individuals have exit options. It often seems impossible to those abused by spouses to leave the family household if they are financially dependent. They may worry that the abusive relationship may be better than the alternative, which is a life in abject poverty. In research on money and domestic abuse, Dana Conner sums it up this way, and I quote, "Economics has both an empowering and disempowering influence on abusive relationships. While the batterer is empowered by his partner's financial dependence, the autonomy of a woman who is victimized is diminished by her abuser's ability to control her through financial means. Moreover, financial instability is one of the greatest reasons why, after gaining freedom, a woman who experiences battering has limited choices and may ultimately acquiesce to her partner's attempts to reconcile. Economic instability is a link that binds a woman to her abuser. End of quote. So ensuring that dependent spouses have access to an income support, even when their spouse is rich enough to support them, is a way to make them more financially independent, making it easier in turn for them to live in an abusive household. Women remain more likely to be dependent on their spouses than men. Therefore, making income support scheme more individual is also likely to help advance the goal of a more gender-equal society, one where dependent wives have more freedom to create abusive relationship and have more bargaining power within the family unit. Universal basic income is delivered per individual rather than per household, in part to address those challenges. Interestingly, conservatives are worried that more individual benefits would have a negative effect on marriages and divorces, and that divorces would become more likely. In fact, the income experiment, I don't know how many of you have heard about it, in the town of Dauphin in Manitoba, Canada, was at first criticized and eventually ended, in part for causing an increase in divorce rates. Researchers disproved these results later on. There's interesting research by Evelyn Forget that you can find online. But it's interesting that at the time, increases in divorce rates were seen as a serious limitation of the policy, undermining family solidarity. From an egalitarian perspective, however, there's no reason to be very concerned here. On the contrary, it is worrying that a substantial number of spouses stay married for lack of a basic alternative source of income. So more individualized benefits are preferable from that perspective. So the feminist egalitarian perspective is probably one of the most pertinent to motivate the individual feature of basic income from the egalitarian perspective. But there is another quite important egalitarian angle to approach individuality from, and this is one that's not talked about quite as much. Young adult dependents are also invisible dependents that may be vulnerable to forms of wrongful dependency. If we are worried about relational domination, then we should also ask whether there's something problematic about the fact that young adults may live under the authority and control of their parents, being potentially infantilized and patronized. The assumption that we can trust parents to look after their young adult children is understandable, but the fact that young adults are expected to depend on their parents' support for survival should be questioned. In the UK and in France, those under the age of 25 years old are treated importantly differently than older age groups in terms of the benefit system. In France, since the end of the 80s and up until 2010, young people below the age of 25 years old were not eligible for monthly means-tested 500 euros a month guaranteed income. And that's something that older age groups were able to access. There was kind of the premise was that they were expected to depend on their families. In the UK, young adults below the age of 22 years old are get much less benefits than older age groups as well. So the expected dependency of young adults on their parents is problematic for many reasons. Parents are in a position to coerce their young adults into making choices that they would not make otherwise. I'll only support you if you do X rather than Y, if you major in computer science, let's say, rather than philosophy. And this prolonged economic dependency on one's parents for financial support seems at least questionable. So that's something that we don't talk as much about, but it may be relevant in contexts where young adults are expected to depend on their families for much longer and are ineligible for benefits or are receiving lower benefits than older age groups. Okay, very good. Basic income is also unconditional. So you can see the definition, it's unconditional and without work requirement, delivered to all without work requirement. So that's perhaps more importantly and controversially than all the other features of basic income. It is unconditional when most welfare systems involve some conditionality. In most welfare schemes, people are supported in exchange for a commitment and a willingness to find paid employment, or to accept a job if one is offered. People are given benefits on the condition that they accept the training recommended by the advisor, and their benefits can be discontinued if they do not accept to take on a paid employment when an offer is made. This is often referred to as welfare through work. In the UK, benefit claimants can lose their benefits in that way. It can be sanctions, and that's also the case in France since the new reform of the benefit system. So European welfare systems are mostly conditional in that way for two related reasons, activation and deterrence. The concept of activation refers to the attempt to bring people back from benefits into paid employment. This is for obvious reasons. Jobs often pay better than the welfare state. They turn individuals into contributors rather than dependents, which is best for their community. They give people a sense of self-worth and a recognition that they don't have with benefits. A job is a right, and most benefit seekers want a job. So it makes sense. But people could be offered jobs, guidance and training without being treated with loss of benefits. So why are those really conditional? One answer is that people might not know what is best for them. So it's kind of a paternalistic motivation for making benefits more conditional. The benefit system is designed to strongly incentivize taking jobs, thus making it more likely that people will actually go back into work. That's the idea. The other answer is that taxpayers tend to resent those who receive welfare payments. So the system is meant to deter those who would be tempted to live a life without working, free riding on others' work, and that's partly to be seen by the taxpayer as craning out the undeserving poor. UBI proponents take a radically different approach to this. They assert that we should do away with work requirements and sanctions associated with the delivery of cash benefits. Depending on whether they are laborists and think that a job is essential to a life well lived, or post-laborists or post-productivists, and have given up on job, UBI proponents may still want the unemployed to have access to training and advising. But what all UBI proponents share in common is that cooperations should not be a requirement to get the very basic income that you need to lead a minimally decent life. There are very many different kinds of reasons for less conditionality. For a start, there isn't full employment. So it is cruel and morally dubious on some views to deny the unemployed a basic standard of living. Second, it is proven that more conditional systems are better at activation. This in some contexts. In fact, Finland's main motivation for experimenting basic income is the sense that unconditional benefits may be more efficient at bringing the unemployed back into work. This is partly because it avoids the benefits trap phenomenon, it's sometimes called the poverty trap or the unemployment trap. When people are on benefits, they are afraid to take on employment that is temporary or part-time by fear of losing their benefits, risking to have to survive weeks without benefits in case they lose their jobs, which is quite current with temporary contracts. And this is very important. This is actually one of the very, I would say, dominant motivations of some governments to pursue basic income research. But let me focus here on the social egalitarian perspective on why we should go for more conditionality. So first, a social egalitarian would clearly be concerned by the view that anyone would be left in absolute destitution, regardless of the choices they made. As I briefly hinted at earlier, social egalitarians disagree with like egalitarians that choice is all that matters to determine whether inequalities are justified. Surely it would be unfair if work, effort, and merit were meant no difference whatsoever in society as to how much people are getting. But that should not mean that people should be allowed to fall below a critical threshold because of the choices they make. Sanctions and discontinuations of benefits make people vulnerable to all sorts of oppression and domination. By preventing extreme economic insecurity, UBI reduces some of those risks. Second, a social egalitarian would object to work requirements in order to confront work hierarchies and segregation. Some forms of valuable work are not recognized, such as care work. The exclusive concentration on activation of many benefit systems devalues occupations that do contribute to society without being remunerated in the labor market. those forms of work is a necessary condition of the recognition of carers as contributors. Other forms of work might also deserve some recognition, such as volunteering, caring, political activism. The goal of community where people relate to each other as equals could thus be greatly improved by more unconditional benefits, by providing more recognition for the kinds of work that are not currently assigned value, monetary value in the labor market. But here, a participation income of the sort that Anthony Atkinson has been arguing for, which is basically UBI, but only for people who agree to participate. And the difference with existing conditional benefits is that there is a very inclusive list of activities that count as work, so that's his alternative. In a sense, that would be a way to address this concern, right? That would be a way to actually give a wage to many different occupations and recognize them in the meantime. And the advantage of that proposal is that it allows screening out activities that we don't think are valuable, like, for example, surfing in Malibu or playing games all day. So that's the idea. So this is like a much, from the perspective of social egalitarians, this is much of an improvement on that front still. This leaves the problem of the existing worry that absolute deprivation should be something that we make sure that we get people out of, regardless of what they decide to do. But it seems like a step further in that direction. But in practice, conditional benefits are delivered with the assistance of a huge bureaucratic apparatus. Welfare advisors and controllers are given discretionary power to monitor the claimants, intrude in their lives, punish them for failures to comply, and eventually deny them the benefits they require to survive. Now, being concerned with domination and hierarchies, social egalitarians ought to be concerned with the power endowed to street-level bureaucrats by welfare institutions. This micro-domination can be avoided by making the delivery of benefits less intrusive and punitive. But the best way to protect claimants is to make the payment an unconditional right, and to change the role of welfare officers from controllers to advisors. UBI eliminates the micro-domination and infantilizing that goes on in the delivery of conditional benefits. If you want to get a sense of what that micro-domination might look like, there's a very good movie by Ken Loach that describes the benefit system in the UK. And I would definitely recommend it. It gives a very clear sense of the amount of intrusion that goes on in establishing eligibility for welfare payments. And last, conditional benefits, especially those that are punitive, condone an endemic demonization of the poor, which actively undermines the social egalitarian ideal of a society where people relate to each other as equals. The obsession with screening out the undeserving underclass, the welfare queens and benefits scroungers, has generated a toxic and dividing rhetoric that undermines the equal standing of those least vulnerable and puts at risk the social cohesion so dear to social egalitarians. Such demonization creates dangerous binaries between virtuous and non-virtuous members of a community, and fools at growing disrespect for the least advantaged. At worst, politicians have instrumentalized this divide to get elected, promising to screen out scroungers even further from the welfare state. At best, they tend to address this problem in a naive and short-sighted way, making benefits even more conditional, to show that they are indeed making it impossible for scroungers to abuse the system. But by doing this, they have strengthened the myth that benefits claimants are indeed often undeserving of public assistance, whereas there is actually no social evidence to provide that. Prove that. UBI promises a radical paradigm shift by proposing to take things the opposite way, doing away with work conditionalities altogether, while also rejecting means testing, so that the working poor also benefit from the policy. And the kind of the part that's not means tested that leads us to the universal feature of basic income that I'm going to address now. So as an egalitarian, it makes sense to support a version of the basic income described above, so one that's individual and unconditional, but it would also make sense to target it at the least well-off, Right? If you're an egalitarian, you worry about how the least well-off in society are faring. So why just spread all the resources that we would need for basic income across the population rather than focusing on those work poorest? Perhaps basic income should be aimed at those earning less than 2,000 euros a month in France. That was the proposal of the French candidate of the Socialist Party, Benoît Hamon. Such a basic income would include the unemployed, but also the working poor, and even the not-so-poor working class, right? But it would be targeted at those who really need it. Basic income, however, does not target the poorest half of the community. It is for everyone, rich and poor, workers and unemployed, old and young. Egalitarians want to make sure that the least well-off are as well-off as they can be, so how can we make sense of that? It is important to note first that on UBI proposals, even the rich would get UBI, but an important part of it would be taxed back. There could also be a way for the rich to opt out of the scheme or donate their UBI back. So what may seem to be a high price to pay for egalitarians might in fact not so much of a problem. Right? But still, why give it to the rich at all? Isn't it just an inefficient way to deliver public benefits? There's a way in which one could defend basic income, universal basic income, giving it to the rich as benefiting the least well-off. There is a lot of stigma attached to receiving benefits, partly because of the general demonization of that benefit claimants suffer from that I've just described, but also because not having a job can cause a loss of self-confidence and self-respect. The stigma is so strong indeed that many eligible persons do not apply for cash payments. An important number of people would rather be poor than being welfare dependents or members of the underclass. By giving UBI to everyone, receiving a welfare payment would be destigmatized. The mechanism is simple. Giving free lunches to all kids in school, even those with rich enough parents, is less stigmatizing than singling out the poorest to give them a free lunch. In Alaska, where every family gets a dividend, receiving cash is non-stigmatizing by essence. Giving basic income to the rich may be a small price to pay for social cohesion and enhanced solidarity. For instance, the French higher education system is free for all, for those who can pay fees, could pay fees, and for those who cannot. As a result, the system is widely popular, and rich and poor parents defend it. Universal coverage gives people an immense sense that they are all in this together. An interesting example of what this universality can create is a finding by David Kalinsky in the context of a mid-income experiment in Canada again. His research showed that recipients of the universal basic income, in that particular example, went from viewing welfare moralistically to viewing it pragmatically. This suggests not only that UBI may be less stigmatizing than targeted BI, This suggests not only that UBI may be less stigmatizing than a targeted BI, because the general perception of welfare could be transformed. It suggests that universal coverage with progressive taxation may thus be preferred on social egalitarian grounds to targeted and means tested benefits. Very last thing, I'm going to end because I'm getting to the 40 minutes. Another interesting position in defense of universality is the approach defended by Dorian Warren in the context of racial justice in the US. He asks the same question that I'm asking here: why would egalitarians support UBI as opposed to basic income for the most vulnerable? But he asks it in the context of racial justice. He asks, if we can find the resources to fund UBI, can we not invest in African American communities? If we can build the political will and bank account for UBI, can we do so for reparations? The position that reparations are due to African American is one that egalitarians and social egalitarians are likely to endorse. I mean, that would be an entirely different debate, but it's one that is likely to endorse. The racial wealth gap is enormous. The median black household has more than 50 times less than the median white household. This wealth gap is the result of a long history of domination, which persists today in the form of special segregation, mass incarceration, systemic exclusion. So it seems that here, from an egalitarian perspective, the right answer is to argue for reparations targeting African Americans rather than UBI for all from that perspective. Warren takes an interesting alternative perspective, though. he argues for a universal basic income. And you will find in the Black Lives Matter manifesto a defense of UBI along those lines. So first, he believes that universality must be asserted very strongly so that ex-cons are likely to be included as well. Second, UBI would disproportionately benefit Black Americans since they earn less and white Americans would be taxed more. That's the second argument he used. Moreover, existing welfare support schemes are tainted with racial tropes, prejudices, and biases. African Americans stand to win the most from reform towards more universality. Universality can thus be defended on egalitarian grounds, also in this context of racial justice. I'm going to end here. The last thing was just about why basic income should be regular, should be a monthly payment as opposed to a one-off lump sum. And if you want, I can answer questions on that at the end, but I think I'm going to stop here.
All right, thank you very much for this very interesting talk and for the opportunity to offer a few comments on it. I'll start off with a few general observations on the basic income. So I think the reason why it's becoming popular is not because it's very good, but because it's the only decent idea out there. So I think it's relatively uncontested that we're in for big structural changes that are driven by technological progress. And within the next couple decades or so, we already see these, and we'll see dramatic changes in our labor markets, and they have to do with optimization and routinization. And technological progress has always been around, or since the Industrial Revolution, and people were always scared of it. But this time, I do believe it's different, and the reason it's different is that machines, or code, or computers, or robots, or whatever you want to call it, they now have eyes, ears, and mouths, so they can do a lot more than they used to be able to do, and they can do things like that are super, super complex, and that 5 years ago nobody thought they would be able to do, which is like driving cars. This is a highly complex thing that machines can now do. And it will displace tasks that are performed by humans right now at an unprecedented rate. So I'm very much on the alarmist side here. And so I do think that's one of the developments that's simply going to change welfare states as we know them. They're simply not sustainable, and you won't get the kinds of political coalitions behind them that we have. So I think the challenge for us when it comes to social policy is to find a system in which we decouple the standard of living from a requirement to work, which is what the basic income does, but we also need a system that at the same time doesn't take away incentives to invest in education and to actually work. And that's a tough problem, and basic income is not a good solution to this problem, at least not alone. So basic income is excellent at the former part, decoupling standards of living from actually participating in the labor market, which is what we will need. But I'll argue it fails dramatically on the other part, on the incentive part, and that will actually increase social inequalities, which is exactly what Juliana wants to decrease, and many of us would like to see decreased. So I do think basic income in one form or another is going to be in the mix and will be implemented, and we already see this at a fairly large scale in Finland and in other places. But it's going to be one of several policy instruments. Others include wage insurance. I do think we need universal health insurance. I do think we need a graduation tax. And I do think we need a 100% inheritance tax and things like this, like things that are highly popular in the US, of course. So finding political coalitions behind these things is not going to be easy, but I think the changes are going to be so dramatic that there will be coalitions for these kinds of things. This is coupled with technological changes making, there will be lots of highly educated people, a few winners, because all of these technologies are network technologies. There's going to be one Facebook, one Uber, these kinds of things. And so we have to come up with a system that deals with that. And so I do think there's a political coalition eventually that supports it. So that's just my general take on basic income. It's prominent because it's the only serious proposal out there, not because it's very good, I think. or not without problems. So regarding Juliana's observations, first of all, she deliberately isn't very specific about what type of basic income. And I do understand and I agree that much of the arguments work. But there's one specificity I think is required, which is about how do you finance. And I don't need much specificity, but we need to understand it's going to be progressively financed, period. I mean, there is just no other way. What's been done in Alaska, it's just not going to happen in any other country at any large scale, where the basic income or the equivalent is financed out of oil revenue, essentially. So some manna from heaven, essentially. So it's going to be progressive, and that has implications. So I think that specificity should be added there. One question I have for you is, do you think basic income are you interested in basic income because you think it's the best policy tool to reduce social inequalities, or are you interested in basic income and want to know what is the effect on social inequalities? Because it seems to me that I will agree with you to some degree that it does help in terms of reducing social inequality, and disagree in others. But it strikes me as this is not the policy instrument that comes to mind when I want to address social inequalities. And so I'm interested, I think it's a lot more with protection of minorities, norms that we establish, how we punish violations, these kinds of things. So a much more legal process regarding that. You don't take a position on this, but I would like you to do it. Now, in terms of your specific, it's a very nicely structured talk, where you get a definition of the basic income, which you've seen, and then the three aspects of that. There's a fourth, which I will ignore. The three aspects of that definition are systematically sort of worked through and evaluated regarding whether they will reduce social inequalities. So the first one is the idea that basic income is paid to individuals, not households. And what this solves, according to Juliana, is that it will reduce domination within the family domain. And my take on this is, well, I agree, providing a basic floor for everybody at an individual level increases the bargaining position for the worse off. There's no question about that. Now, however, if that's the problem you want to solve, a little bit of money is not going to do it. So it seems to me very idealistic that this, because there is just no way in which you can control how then within the family is this money distributed, even if you give each family member a bank account. I mean, that's not going to make sure that the dominant family member takes all the money anyways. So I'm not entirely sure that would work. It gets a little, so you want kids and juveniles to have their own money, and I see a sort of, there's a fine line between kids actually needing guardians. I don't think 7-year-olds should have $1,000 and decide what they want to do with it. So, but it's not entirely clear where we would put that line. So nothing ensures that there's a just distribution within the family, no matter how we give the money to their household, to individuals or so I'm not particularly convinced. There's an aspect where that resides there, which is, should we pay money for having kids? And I think the answer is no. You probably think otherwise. The problem is, it's a terrible incentive. If there is any intergenerational transmission of inequality, which there is a lot, that's exactly not the incentive you want to set. I will appear a lot more conservative than I am in this remark. Secondly, and that's the main point, is the issue that it's paid unconditional rather than conditional, and that provides a floor. There's a wide range of arguments in favor of this. It recognizes much more than just labor as a contribution to society. It avoids punitive measures, all the stick in the carrots of stick of welfare state policy tools. It avoids this distinction between virtuous and non-virtuous members. And I agree with much of this. The real problem with the unconditionality is it takes away incentives to participate in the labor market and to invest in education. And we will need people to invest in education. And I'm not paternalistic. I don't care if you drop out of the labor market. In fact, I think if I pay you $1,000 a month and you drop out of the labor market, you should drop out of the labor market. You're a very low productivity type. Everybody's better off if you're not in the labor market. So, and people do this, right? In the last 15 years in the US, males in their 20s drop out of the labor market in alarming rates. Like the participation rates have decreased from 82 to 72%. This is dramatic. And what they do is, from all we understand, is they play video games. They move back to their parents, they play video games. Fine by me. I mean, I think it's a bad choice, right? And they're going to miss a crucial investment time period that they will never make up for. They're not making connections, they don't get the right skills. I don't care. What I do care about, however, is the kids. So you're going to have then families that are in this non-education, non-working state that will have kids, and those kids will not have role models. They will probably have fewer ambitions and things like this. And you will then, therefore, give a future generation no chance. And I think that this would increase, you're generating essentially a two-class system, which is exactly what you don't want to do. You're going to have those that are participating and those that are not. And I can't think of a more clear distinction between, the virtues and the non-virtues, which you think is being reduced. So I'm rather skeptical about the success here. And thirdly, and this is a very, very common argument in the literature about the basic income, it's universal, right? Everybody gets it. Rich people get it, poor people get it, we don't care. And the argument, also the argument you're making, is it removes stigma. And I think that's just a very weak argument, because it assumes that people don't know whether they're net benefit winners or losers. This is why I think it's important you have to take a position on how we finance these things. Well, the way you finance these things is you have an income tax, which is proportional to income, or a rising income, which means rich people pay more taxes than poor people. Everybody gets the same benefit. It's not complicated math to figure out whether you're a net benefit winner or loser. Now, paying everybody money back, even the rich, is just an accounting gimmick. It really is that. And I know Philipp from Paris and others think it's really important that we do this. There might be a bureaucratic reason to do this, but from a stigma point of view, I think it's just naive. People figure this out. And we see this, take the EU. In the EU, every country pays into the EU budget, and some countries get more out of it than others. Everybody knows which these countries are, and they know this, and it's politically salient. And this would be extremely easy to observe, extremely easy to observe. You just take your income taxes, you take your benefits, and you do the math, and you know whether you're a winner or loser. And so this really doesn't work for me as an argument at all. So generally speaking, I'm with you that providing a floor is important and is desirably from several perspectives, including the normative one that I share, and that it has the potential to reduce social inequalities, which is what you desire. One aspect that you don't mention, which I think you could, is it will increase the bargaining power of low-skilled labor. And so we are going to have to pay a lot more money for really bad jobs. And so I think one of the bigger inequalities in our labor markets is that we pay a lot of money to people that do awesome jobs like ourselves, and very little money to people that do very bad jobs. And it seems to me a little paradoxical that that's what we do. It seems like if I have to do a bad job, I should get more money for it. And basic income, which doesn't mean I want less money, basic income would help dramatically, or I think it would help dramatically. However, for me, the big one is I do think that there's a real potential for societies to develop into two types of people, or two types of families. The ones that are participating, the ones that aren't, and it's going to be heavily stigmatized, which is exactly where we want to work. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks. I'm going to give Juliana just 2 minutes quickly if you want to respond to any of that, and then my colleague Lavender will have a microphone. So if you're interested in asking a question, raise your hand and she will find you. Okay, so thanks, Juliana, first.
Okay, thank you so much, Philipp. That was really, really interesting and really helpful. There was so much in there. I don't know how to start, but let me take a few of the things you've said and then just stop randomly when the 2 minutes have ended. So one thing on the individual individual, just to clarify, I don't think that universal basic income will ensure that the distribution of resources in the family is one that is fair and will eliminate domination within the family. I think that it will reduce risks, and I think that's all we can hope for here, and that's already a big deal, I think. And so I think that's something that we often either expect basic income to do too much, and then that's doomed to failure, because of course there are so many other things that matter. So you've talked about social norms in general. So if we think that basic income can, for example, either entirely liberate women from the domination from their husband within the family, or if we think that basic income can entirely eradicate stigma, interclass stigma, then of course we set up basic income for failure. What I was trying to do with this talk is really show that there is a midway between trying to argue that basic income can do too much, and then losing sight of what it can do. And I think what it can do is very important. So again, I would not say that it ensures all those things, that it makes sure that, for example, women have more bargaining powers in family. I think it reduces risks and increases their power. One thing about children and young adults, I think that's really important, and I'm really interested in that. Just to clarify that I think that when I was talking about young adults, I was really talking about young adults, and I remember that's really a contextual issue, because in France it is the case that you're expected to depend on your family up until 25 years old, and you're an adult, right? So I was really talking about the 18 to 25 age group, and maybe 16 to 25, which is how we measure youth employment in many cases. But in terms of how I think we should think about children. So I'm not going to argue that, I'm not exactly going to tackle here your challenge, which was, we shouldn't really encourage people to have kids, and we should worry about the incentives that that sets. And but I would say that there actually, is a way to help out young adults by giving a basic income to kids, which is that we can split the basic income, giving out to the parents in terms of child benefits, and putting the rest in a baby bond, baby bond, so that, and I haven't talked about that at the end of my talk, but that gives them access to capital when they reach adulthood. And I think that if, as egalitarian, we worry about the distribution not just of income, but of wealth as well, this is something that should seriously be, that should be taken seriously. Just one thing about stigma, because I think that's super important, and there were so many important things in what you said, but let's take that one. So again, I think that you're right, and I think that it's true. Some people would be net contributors, and some would be benefited. But I think we still need to look at what universality can provide in terms of this sense that we are all in this together. And of course, you're right. We need more data on that. We need to look at the existing universal benefits that we have in various countries and see how people react to them. But my sense is that even though it doesn't eradicate stigma entirely, you go to university, you don't pay fees, regardless of which family you come from. That must have an effect on how people feel and how people see themselves. And it also creates more social cohesion in the sense that those who are contributing to these institutions tend to support it as well. So I don't know, I agree with you, we shouldn't be too idealistic here and believe that it's going to eradicate stigma, but I think that it can do some work, and we have to, I think, consider it even more now that that we live in societies that are so divisive in terms of who's receiving benefits and who's contributing to those benefits. So yes, you can find out, but you can get how much you're paying in and how much you're getting out. But I think it's incomparably better in a society where one group of people is seen as those welfare scroungers and welfare queens, and others are seen as contributing. Also, basic income can enable something of a multi-sided existence where, maybe that's idealistic, but where if you have to take a year off to look after an aging parent, or you have to take a year off to look after a child that needs support right now and not later, that's something that you can do, and it's not something that you can do that just one group of the population is doing. It's something that everyone can do because of their basic income. So I think that we can see not just as two independent, separate group of people, those who receive benefits and those who don't. We can see it as across the life course, receiving benefits throughout our life to enable work in some parts and not working in other parts and just taking time off. And I think that that contributes to destigmatize receiving benefits, even though it won't eradicate everything. And of course, as long as we have social inequalities, I believe that we'll have stigma. But I think that it can play a role here. And we need more data, we need more evidence.
Hi. I guess I wanted to ask you a question about how you're thinking about the significance of UBI in the context of sort of what I'll call one version of a sort of ideal versus non-ideal theory sort of question. So not in the sort of full compliancy sort of sense, but rather like one thing you might think is we're imagining this against the background of an adequate healthcare system and an adequately just education system and full employment, for example, right? And whereas some of the things that you sort of pointed out was like, look, we don't have full employment, this sort of creates. So I guess part of my worry, if I was, I'm kind of agnostic about this, but if I was going to be a critic of UBI at the non-ideal level, part of my worry would be that there's limited political capital, and should we be trying to press for something like full employment? Should we be trying to press for these other kinds of goals? And when I imagine those things being in place, if there's full employment, then a lot of the kind of UBI as a way of reducing domination kind of arguments are going to get reduced because it's going to be easier for people to enter the labor force, et cetera. And so I just wanted to get a sense of how you were thinking about this. I mean, the starkest sort of version of this is just like, in an ideally just society, do you think it would be important to implement this? Or are you really thinking that the strongest arguments are sort of strategic arguments about the best way to sort of move in a relatively progressive direction from sort of where we are roughly now?
So of course I want to say something in between. So I do believe that we have to start from the existing benefit system and what's not working, and why it should be challenged from the social egalitarian perspective in my case. But I also believe something a bit stronger, which is that it should be the preferred safety net of social egalitarians. Now, the question that you asked earlier about non-ideal circumstances, I take it to be a question about the background conditions, and this is really tricky because it varies from one country to the next. And I grew up in France, I worked in England for 8 years. So I got used to discussing UBI within a context where it was almost primarily defined as an enhancement of the welfare state, of the existing welfare state, and a supplement, right? It was not seen, if it was a reform of something, if it was eliminating something, is the existing guaranteed income, which is conditional and household-based and non-universal. When you move from that to a context where some of the things that you have there, for example in France, affordable healthcare, free higher education, to a context where this is not the background conditions, of course it would completely change your priorities in terms of what you need to push for, what's most important. Now, and that's where I think that some things can be said at the conceptual level, but there are limitations. So in some places I would say that basic income is definitely an improvement of the existing safety net, and that it should be conceptualized as such, and that it should be, if it was the case that basic income was introduced in order to replace the existing benefit system, it would be a big mistake, and maybe it would be better off the way we are right now. In other contexts, like the US, I would say that basic income is even less likely to be sufficient. But I would also say that there is a lot of potential, and that's the strategic aspect. Basic income can be a federating policy, and that's what we need right now in a very divided society. So it's a policy that the movement for Black Lives has defended, the sex workers Open University has defended, but it's also something that the tech community is defending. It's also something that very different groups in the population that don't necessarily talk to each other, don't necessarily agree on very much, and don't necessarily push for policies together. I think that there's an opportunity for very broad coalition, and so it could seem like it's too early in the US and we are not quite ready, and we need many other things before we can fight for basic income, but things could be the other way around. And again, I might be a bit idealistic, I think we need more experiment and more data. But the income experiment, if it showed one thing, was that people's perception of the welfare state changed as a result of receiving more conditional and universal benefits. And so it could be the beginning of another conception of work and what we owe each other and public assistance, rather than just being the end goal and the kind of ideal policy after which we owe nothing more to each other.
On equality, it seems to me the person who criticized you is a little bit dubious. First of all, in the Canadian experiment, there were more investments in human capital, mostly medical, but some education. Second, you're right that wages got bid up because it was universal. But also, wouldn't the rich, won't they profit more from cheap labor? So when you bid low wages up, that's going to equalize the system as well, it seems to me. So you equivocated. You said at first that inequality would increase, and then you said at the end it would decrease. It seems to me net effects would be a decrease in inequality.
Do you want to say something, or?
Yeah, so Juliana distinguishes between social and economic inequality. I guess that's the distinction here. There is, so if you finance the basic income in a progressive way, there is no question that it will reduce inequality. It's just that. However, what worries me, and that's her concern, is that it will increase social inequality. I would argue it's likely to increase social because of Fitch's winners.
Okay, very good. So I think that gives me an opportunity to reply to your point. Thank you so much. So I think, so first, I wouldn't separate economic inequalities from social inequalities, right? I'd say that social inequalities include, so I have a much broader perspective where I think that we need to shift away from the distributive paradigm and only think about, right? They are linked, of course, and so, and all the things that I say about domination, of course, they have economic inequalities and distributive justice is huge, whether people are going to be able to stand in front of each other as equals or not. So I would not separate them so much. But I think you said something very important. So I don't think that, I don't see UBI as necessarily reducing incentives to, and that's maybe something that worries me actually, reducing incentives to go back to the labor market or to work at all, or to educate yourself at all. In fact, so I think two things here. One is that we tend to collapse jobs and work. We do it over and over and over again in our society. So there is a lot of work that is being done and needs to be done and could be done and should be done and it's not being done because we are obsessed about jobs and we fetishize jobs in the labor market. So I think that there is plenty of work that needs to be done. There's plenty of work that is already being done, volunteering, care work, without being remunerated. So I don't see it as necessarily providing negative incentives for work. It might provide incentives to work in the labor market. Even then, I mean, the evidence so far is not showing that. So I totally agree that we need more evidence of that. I want to know exactly what it would produce because so many of the things that I'm saying depend on what it would actually cause, right? So of course, I want to know exactly what it would do, but the evidence so far in developing countries, so in Kenya, in India, the evidence is that people are far more likely to be in the labor market after they've received unconditional cash than before. And the evidence in Finland is that more unconditional benefits are better at bringing people back in the labor market because it eliminates the unemployment trap, the benefits trap. So I'm not too worried about that, but I do worry very much about the dystopian picture that you put forward. And something I think about a lot, this kind of society where people are divided between those who are seen as contributing and those who are not seen as contributing. And this is where I think we need a paradigm shift here. And that's a big thing to say because of course it's difficult to bring about a paradigm shift. The question is whether basic income can contribute to getting us there. And that's a big question. So once again, I don't think that it's just the policy, the fact of giving people cash, which is going to solve that problem. I think it's the conversation that we would need to have around how we now want to spend our time, what opportunities we provide for people to spend their time. And I think the debate that needs to be had surrounding the transition to a basic income society is just as important as the delivery of cash itself.
Hi, thank you for that. So thank you for the talk. This has been really wonderful. I'm puzzled by the stigma, and I'm thinking of Ira Katz-Nelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was Right, and I don't want to go too American because it sounds as though maybe some of the things that you're looking at are different case studies, but if I could just run with it for a moment. When I think about the introduction of common schooling and public schooling in the United States, I think of that as something that was universally available to everyone, even though not everybody took advantage of it. And what's interesting about that is that there's no stigma per se attached to going to public school. There might be a stigma attached to what people think you got out of that experience or the quality of the school. But it seems to me like there's something going on there, and that the reason why I suggest that is that it seems to me that there wasn't also a stigma with many of the things that were happening with the welfare state when the demographic profile of the people who were receiving those benefits looked a certain way. And so then the worry that I have about universal basic income is that you still have those underlying aesthetic, maybe I'll call them, worries. And I'm wondering about how this impacts that dynamic, or whether it could actually impact it at all, or if it would. And here I'm thinking in particular about borders, whether it would increase sort of border nationalism and go against maybe some of the more open border or cooperative border arrangement kinds of situations that I might be. So maybe that's an economics question, but yeah.
Thank you so much for both your point. On the aesthetic worry, I mean, again, I really think that we're going to have to, I moved to the US a year and a half ago, and I'm just adjusting to a very different political context, and I do realize that the challenges are of different nature, and so the aesthetic worry, I worry about it, but I think that's one more reason to think that we need policies that force us to think differently about work and what's in life and how we should spend our time. And I think one of the things that you said, Philipp, earlier, I didn't really talk about, which is extremely important, is the very fact in the society that we accept that those who are doing the work that is hardest are paid the least well, and that often those tasks are extremely socially useful. This is something that is at the core of the organization of positions in society that needs to be challenged. And I think basic income, by giving people more bargaining power, forces us again to rethink what jobs we find valuable. So I think it won't happen on its own, but I'm hopeful that I don't see another policy, I think I would put it the way you put it, I don't think another policy that's so much potential in forcing us and thinking differently about all those things. So I think we need to take that opportunity. It's a very big opportunity. On the case of border nationalism, or borders and basic income, that's a very big question. So one of the worries of people when basic income is put forward as a potential policy is that it would have a pull effect on migrants, and that as a result, those who tend to be more on the right of the political spectrum tend to think that that's an issue in itself, that's a problem. Those who are more progressive have kind of different but related worry, which is that there is no way to introduce basic income without in the current context, without being stricter on immigration, and that would be terrible for those who are least well off in that circumstance. I think there are quite a few answers to that problem. One is to say that we need to think about basic income at different levels, and of course it's going to sound very utopian again and very idealistic, but we have to remember that basic income as such was not even seen as an acceptable policy not so long ago. We need to think about basic income at the transnational level as well. And there are already existing proposals. So Philipp Rehm has this EU dividend proposal. So it was conceptualized in the context of the European Union, and it was the idea that every single EU citizen should get a 200 euros basic income every month, which would make it such that in some countries 200 euros is enough to lead a minimum decent life, and so people would not be forced to move. But of course, each state would have to top up that basic income so that people can actually live decent of life. And so the idea is that that would have a stabilizing effect also on migration, which is not to accept the premise that migration is wrong and a problem, but which is to say we have to think about addressing poverty wherever it is, and so it's not just within your domestic state. There are also proposals for global dividend, global resource dividend. I think we seriously need to have those discussions as well. There's no way for progressives to get around that problem unless they address it at the global level as well. One last thing I want to say about this is it's very important who gets invited around the table when basic income is being discussed, debated, and or in the political context. There are some groups right now that support basic income that are particularly concerned about undocumented migrants and workers. So thinking now of, for example, Ajin Pu from the National Guest Workers, National Domestic Workers Alliance, who is particularly interested in basic income and how it can help domestic workers. And so there are all sorts of vulnerable people in this country that need to be included in the discussion. Otherwise, it is likely that they will be excluded when it comes to designing how it should be introduced. So it's really about voice right now and about how the policy gets conceptualized and how it gets defended. Is it only presented as an answer to automation, or is it presented as a way to decrease work segregation and remunerate care work and provide more bargaining power to workers? Is it framed in all those ways, or is it only framed in one particular way? Is there just a single story, or are there many different stories?
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Professor Bidadanure. Absolutely compelling talk. So I have a question about how much of a problem is it that UBI seems also to have become adopted by political forces and political ideologies that are frankly not egalitarian. And I guess here in the US, we tend to speak about the Scandinavian countries as inherently progressive and if not leftist, but of course the Finnish government that has adopted the UBI is a conservative government. And there are these criticisms that you also hear from the left that are pointing out that, well, possibly we're being scammed into sort of jumping on this train, that it may actually be almost like a neoliberal ploy that is going to, serve to hollow out our achievements that have been made in welfare systems and so forth. So, I mean, I am compelled by your talk, but I wonder, is this, are we acknowledging the seriousness of this problem sufficiently, and what possible ways do we have out of this dilemma?
So that's a very good question. Actually, that was part of my motivation for this talk was also, for writing this talk, was also to think a bit more about what strong egalitarian reasons are there possible to basic income in a context where I would still say that the vast majority of people defending basic income, at least in the basic income network, are quite progressive. But it is true that, at least in terms of the representation of the discourse for basic income in the media, there is more and more support that comes from the right and comes from people who sometimes, the extreme cases, people who think of basic income as a replacement for everything else. So of course that's a worry, but I think the left and unions are not addressing that worry in the right way for me. So when something like that happens, you don't just throw the baby with the bathwater in some sense, right? You, I truly believe that with all the changes that we are witnessing right now, the future of work is at risk. The future of work, I mean, the present of work is at risk as well. And I think that there is no escaping a very serious debate on the future of income security and on the future of the non-conditional safety net. So I think the right to an income is a conversation that we can't escape. Now the right way to make sure that that debate doesn't get completely co-opted by the wrong forces. If you're progressive, if you're a union member, or if you're on the left, I think, is to make sure that all those who are concerned who could benefit from an enhanced safety net are around the discussion and are around the table when it gets decided. So So I guess my answer would just be to say we need a broad coalition anyway, and we need to make sure that that debate is not left within a too narrow community, and that all the different communities are included in that debate. I don't think that it has to be a Trojan horse of neoliberalism, or however it's been referred to. I think that if it ends up being uniquely defined or in priority defined within the neoliberal paradigm, all that it would have said is that the left would have failed to see the opportunity that there was in actually taking that idea very seriously and pushing forward a very progressive version of the basic income proposal. So, yeah.
Okay, this thing's on. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming out and speaking with us. This isn't necessarily regarding basic income, but egalitarian principles in public policy overall. I'm going to go ahead and address the American elephant in the room. The rise of the populist ideology of America First has become apparent in the United States thanks to efforts of the current administration. And in many ways, it can be argued that this ideology openly combats many of the core principles of the ideology of egalitarianism. And you offer a crucial perspective, given you can offer an outside look on our current political climate. So on the concept of incorporating more egalitarian proposals into U.S. policy, brass tacks, in your opinion, how can we best palette this ideology for the American people, given that the America First way of thinking, at least from what we've seen so far, is very much anti-globalization, extensively emphasizing competition, and a work for what you get or starve mentality. Do we have empirical evidence yet that is substantial enough to convince the American people to adopt more egalitarian principles? Is more time needed, or do we even have a good answer at the moment?
Thank you. That was a very good question. I don't know if I can be of much help to help figure out whether there is any room for pushing the egalitarian, or how exactly we should frame all those, for example, policies in order for it to work right now. Just one thing I would say about basic income is right now the main challenge, and I think it's not just in the US, it's everywhere, is to take seriously the right to work. People want to work, right? And so when, so there were very interesting focus groups made with truck drivers who stand to lose their jobs in great number in the very close future, asking them what they thought about UBI, and they tend to react quite negatively to it because they see it as, so first of course they see it as, well, giving up on their jobs, giving up on the struggle that needs to be led to keep jobs. They see it as a welfare handout, and they don't want to be dependent. They want a job, and we live in a society where not having a job is, all the things I said earlier, very stigmatized, very difficult it's very difficult to lead a good life without having a job, even if you had an income, right? So I think that's the thing that we need to take very seriously, is how do we rethink the preponderance of jobs in our understanding of work, and how do we provide a sufficiently supportive environment so that people can feel empowered to do the work that needs to be done, the caring work, the volunteering work, the educational work, without feeling like they are a burden on society and they are not making a contribution. Right? This is really the challenge, and I think, again, I would say, because I think that this is the important takeaway point, there is a unique opportunity now to bring together around the table very different people that don't talk to each other, and this has created the current political result that we have now, a very divided context where people don't understand each other, and half of the population is resenting the other. So I think if we can, instead of thinking strategically about how we might get people who are against the egalitarian agenda to buy basic income, I think we should think the other way around, which is how can we use basic income in a way to bring all those people together and think differently about the future of distribution and jobs and work.
Well, let's thank our speakers.